They mocked him in whispers that cut sharper than shouts, called him a bum, wrinkled their noses, stepped aside like he carried disease. When Isaac Trenner walked into that courthouse, dragging a duffel bag soaked in rain and years of silence, not one soul knew the truth hiding in its seams. A guard shoved his belongings aside like trash. A prosecutor chuckled about wasting taxpayer money, and a child whispered, "Why does he look so dirty?" But Isaac said nothing. Not when they laughed. Not when they judged. Not even when the gavel slammed down on his name. He just stared ahead. Stone still, like a man who'd seen war and knew silence could speak louder than rage. What none of them knew was that the man they dismissed had once carried a wounded lieutenant through mortar fire. A lieutenant now seated behind the bench in robes of authority. Before this story ends, that same courtroom would rise to its feet for a man the world tried to erase. Because some names refuse to stay forgotten. If that still means something to you, stay with me. Comment honor if you believe the quiet ones carry the heaviest truth. And if your heart still stands for those who stood for us, you'll feel right at home here. Isaac Trenner was 74 years old, though his spine still carried the weight of a soldier half that age and twice as proud. His frame was lean, wiry, weathered by time, but not yet bowed by it. Deep lines carved by sun, grief, and sandstorms creased his face like riverbeds, and a ghost-gray beard framed a jaw that hadn't trembled even when bullets once sang past it. He wore the same clothes nearly every day, a threadbare army jacket too thin for winter, and a faded ball cap with no logo, just years of sun bleaching it down to pale silence. Every morning, at precisely 6:17, Isaac folded his blanket with military corners, rinsed a cracked mug twice before filling it with instant coffee, then sat on the courthouse steps to sip in silence, facing east, always east, like he was still on watch. He lived alone in a 10-by-10 shelter unit behind a church, shared by pigeons and memories, his only visitors being the shadows that slipped under his door at night. No family called. No neighbors waved. No one asked why he kept a duffel bag always zipped, always near, like a soldier still waiting for orders. 30 years ago, Isaac had been Sergeant Trenner of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Armored Division, deployed during Desert Storm. He'd earned a Silver Star pulling wounded from burning vehicles under direct fire. His shoulder still bore the fragment of a mortar shell they never removed. But here, in the city where no one remembered, he was just an old man who smelled of oil and silent. The courthouse guards looked through him. Children glanced and turned away. Even the woman at the soup kitchen called him "Sir," with the tone reserved for pity. And yet, that morning, just before the rain came, a rookie cop narrowed his eyes at Isaac's bag, muttered something into his radio, and tightened his grip on his belt. Something shifted in the air, the kind of silence that came just before thunder. The courtroom smelled like old paper, cheap cologne, and something wet that had clung to Isaac's coat since the morning rain. He walked with slow, steady steps, each one echoing on the marble floor like a reluctant drumbeat. His duffel bag thumped behind him, soaked dark, seams frayed, its weight dragging like the years he carried in silence. He crossed the threshold, and for a breathless second, every conversation stopped. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why does that man look so dirty?" She pulled him close, said nothing. Across the room, a clerk grimaced. 2 men in suits leaned away. "Smells like something died," one muttered. His friend chuckled. Might have been him. Isaac kept moving. He didn't flinch, didn't look, didn't speak. He walked like he had somewhere to be, even if no one had invited him there. At the metal detector, a young guard barely glanced up. Hat off, bag too. Isaac hesitated for a moment, then slid it forward. Inside was everything. His medals, old letters, dog tags dulled with time. The guard shoved it aside without a glance. Next. Isaac walked through. He sat alone at the defense table, no lawyer beside him, no allies in the room. Just a folded coat over his shoulders and a cheap nameplate. Trenner, I. From the opposite side, Assistant District Attorney Preston Hale rose with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. Young, sharp-suited, voice cold. Your Honor, he began. The state moves forward with a single request. Efficiency. The defendant is a repeat vagrant. A public nuisance. A threat. He turned slightly toward the gallery, hands open. 3 days ago, Mr. Trenner was asked, politely, to leave Fairhaven Mall. Instead, he threw a glass bottle at Security Officer Cole Turner, resulting in a concussion. Gasps rippled. Yes, he served in Desert Storm, but prior service does not excuse future violence. What we have here is not a veteran, but a problem. Isaac sat still, not blinking, not breathing. Across from him, his public defender, Maya Ridgewell, barely 30, fumbled through papers without meeting his gaze. We acknowledge the incident, she stammered. We are not contesting charges. Isaac turned to her, voice hoarse. That's not. But she didn't hear him. Preston smirked. Spare us the speech, Mr. Trenner. Take a number like everyone else. Laughter flickered through the benches. The gavel slammed once. Silence. Isaac stood, slow and shaky. Tried to speak again. Nothing came but breath. The bailiff gestured. Sit. He sat. Near the rear wall, Deputy Ethan Morgan leaned in toward the court clerk. That guy. What's his name again? Trenner. Isaac Trenner. The name echoed, soft but heavy. Something flickered in Morgan's eyes. He didn't say a word, just looked once at the duffel bag, left outside the courtroom, forgotten, soaking, unguarded. And in that moment, as the rain tapped the high windows and the walls held their breath, Isaac looked up, not at the judge, not at his lawyer, but toward the gallery, to see if anyone was still watching. Because sometimes, the quietest moment is just the last calm before everything breaks. The prison gates creaked open beneath a sky of bruised gray. Rain slicked the concrete yard as Isaac Trenner stepped out of the transport van, wrists chained, shoulders hunched beneath a soaked coat that had stopped keeping him warm years ago. A guard shoved him forward. Move it, Grandpa. He didn't reply. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly green tint over every crack and stain. Officer Hank Miller scanned a clipboard without looking up. Name! Trenner, Isaac rasped. Isaac Gertie. Miller snorted. Still breathing, huh? They led him through halls, lined with steel doors, until stopping at cell D14. Inside, 2 metal bunks, one occupied. Travis Dean, white, mid-30s, lean with a buzz cut, tattoos from temple to throat, and a scar curling beneath one eye, didn't look up. You, the new one. Isaac said nothing. Travis swung his legs over the edge of the top bunk. Didn't expect my new roommate to be halfway in the grave. No response. Isaac just eased onto the bottom bunk, careful with his ribs, his silence sharper than insult. That night, when the lights dimmed and the cell block went quiet, Isaac lay awake. Pain flared across his ribs with every breath. He reached into his coat's lining and touched the edge of a dog tag, dull, worn smooth with age. He whispered the name, engraved on it, as if to remind the darkness, I was someone. The next morning the doors opened with a mechanical groan. Isaac shuffled out with the others. In the cafeteria, he sat alone at a corner table, untouched tray in front of him. Across the room, eyes lingered. One inmate leaned toward Travis. That him? Travis grinned. Yeah. Old man still thinks he's in uniform. They moved in a pack. One slammed a tray down. Oatmeal splattered across Isaac's coat. Another knocked his bread to the floor. No one interfered. Guards glanced, then looked away. "What's the matter, Sergeant?" Travis mocked. "Forget how to fight." Isaac met his gaze, said nothing. Then came the shove. Isaac fell sideways, his head striking the bench. Blood ran down his temple, warm against the cold floor. He lay still, not because he couldn't rise, but because he'd risen too many times for too little. Eventually he stood, slow and shaky, and limped out, leaving red drops behind him. In the hallway, Deputy Ethan Morgan pinned a labor sheet to the board when Isaac passed. He paused. "Hey." Isaac didn't speak, just turned, eyes swollen, one side of his face bruised. "You all right?" Morgan asked. Isaac nodded faintly, a kind of nod that meant no, but I'll manage. Morgan didn't push. Not yet. That night, Morgan sat at his desk under flickering light, scrolling through old files. His finger stopped on a name. Trenner Isaac. Sergeant. Desert. Storm. Silver. Dart Deotinarchy. Below it, a name he hadn't heard in years. Lieutenant Harold Brenner. Morgan's throat tightened. He picked up the phone. "Records? I need access to the evidence locker. There's a bag. It belongs to someone who shouldn't be here." Then he stood, quietly, slowly. Nothing dramatic. No word spoken. But everything had just shifted. The infirmary smelled of bleach and old sorrow. Isaac sat on the edge of the metal bed, blood crusted at his temple, breath shallow. Nurse Lorraine Bell, gray-haired, no nonsense, worked in silence. Her hands were steady until she saw the scar near his collarbone. Jagged, deep, unmistakable. Her voice broke the stillness. "You serve." He nodded faintly. "Desert Storm. 3rd Battalion. Iron Vultures." She paused. "Iron Vultures." Her tone shifted. "My cousin, Frank Benton. He was one of yours." Isaac blinked slowly. Tall guy. Always humming old gospel songs. Took a hit to the thigh. I pulled him out. Lorraine froze. "He died last year," she whispered. But he never stopped talking about the man who saved him. Said his name was Cole. Cole carried him through hell. Isaac lowered his gaze, as if ashamed. She pressed 2 gauze pads into his palm. "You ever need a quiet place, come find me." He nodded. "No thanks." Just a nod. When he stepped out into the corridor, Deputy Ethan Morgan stood waiting. In his hand, Isaac's duffel bag. Restored. Reverent. "Polite." "You left this behind," Morgan said. Isaac stared. "You opened it." Morgan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Their eyes met. No words. Just understanding. Later that day, in the dining hall, Travis Dean swaggered across the room like nothing had changed. He dropped onto a bench across from Isaac. "Heard you made a friend. Got yourself a nurse and a babysitter now?" He sneered. "You must be somebody real important." His voice was loud, mocking. The room didn't laugh this time. They listened. Eyes shifted. Spoons hovered midair. Morgan entered, uniform crisp, boots echoing against linoleum like slow thunder. He stopped beside Travis. Said nothing. Just stared. Travis smirked. "Can I help you, officer?" Morgan didn't blink. He reached into his coat and pulled out a document. Folded, old, stamped with government insignia. He placed it gently on the table between them. "July 14th, 1991, he said. "New Demia outpost. Mortar fire." One soldier pulled an unconscious lieutenant from a crater, carried him 3 miles under fire. Travis snorted. "What's that got to do with me?" Morgan leaned forward. The lieutenant's name was Harold Brenner. You know what he became. Silence. "A judge." Travis's grin twitched. Morgan's voice dropped. "The same judge who signed the papers putting him in here." The room was frozen. Every inmate still. Every guard silent. The air didn't move. Even the lights seemed dimmer. Morgan turned to Isaac. "Sir," he said softly, "your record has been cleared. You're going home." Travis blinked, swallowed. His jaw tightened, but not in defiance. Something else. The first flicker of recognition, of fear. Morgan looked down at him one last time. "Maybe next time, watch who you're laughing at." He turned. Isaac stood, the duffel bag in his hand. And Travis Dean didn't say another word. The courthouse looked different that morning. The marble halls, once cold and dismissive, now gleamed under solemn light. No one sneered as Isaac Trenner stepped off the transport van. No one mocked the way he walked. No one questioned the duffel bag held firmly to his chest like a piece of memory that refused to die. Deputy Ethan Morgan waited at the top of the steps, not in uniform, but standing tall with a coat folded over one arm. "It's cold," he said, gently draping it across Isaac's shoulders. Isaac looked at him, not with surprise, but with the kind of quiet understanding only men who've seen battle carry in their eyes. He nodded, then walked. Inside, a silence spread like reverence. Reporters whispered, but none dared raise a camera. Officers stood aside. Inmates watching from behind bulletproof glass stood still. And as Isaac entered courtroom 6, a man in plain clothes stood waiting, not as a judge, not today, but as a man stripped bare by truth. Harold Brenner. His face had changed. Pale, still. In his trembling hand, a manila folder. He stepped forward slowly, and when their eyes met, 30 years collapsed into a single breath. "It was you," Brenner whispered. "You pulled me from that crater." Isaac said nothing. "I never knew your name. Not until now." Then, without warning, without ceremony, Judge Harold Brenner dropped to one knee. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The man who once signed Isaac's sentence bowed his head to the one who had once saved his life. "I sentenced you without seeing you," he said, voice cracking. "But you carried me through hell. I owe you everything." A murmur swelled. Lucy, the court clerk who once called Isaac just another homeless case, stepped forward, carrying the duffel bag with 2 hands, as if it were sacred. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Isaac took it, held it, not with anger, not with pride, but with silence. Then Brenner turned to the courtroom. "Vacate the conviction. Expunge the record. Return his property. Effective immediately." He paused, then added, "And add his name to the Hall of Honor." Gasps turned into stillness. A tear slid down Lucy's cheek. Someone in the gallery said softly, "My God, we were wrong." No one moved as 2 officers stepped toward the back of the room, not toward Isaac, but toward Travis Dean, standing frozen by the exit. One whispered, "You're wanted for falsifying records and aggravated assault." Travis stammered, I didn't know who he was." His eyes darted. It wasn't personal. But no one answered. The officers turned him around. Cold steel cuffs clicked into place. As he was led past Isaac, Travis didn't look up. Couldn't. His head was low. The silence swallowed him. Isaac stood still. He didn't smile. Didn't flinch. Just gripped the strap of the duffel bag and let the moment pass over him like wind through open doors. The wind outside the courthouse had softened, but inside, the silence held firm like a prayer no one wanted to interrupt. Isaac Trenner stood beneath the high ceiling of courtroom 6, his duffel bag pressed gently to his chest, metals faintly clinking inside like echoes from another life. No applause. No headline shouted. But the shift was undeniable. Subtle, slow, human. Lucy Medina, the court clerk who once read the charges against him, without looking up, stepped forward. Her eyes were red. Her voice, a whisper. "I'm sorry." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't have to. She simply folded her hands and bowed her head. Behind her, A bailiff who had once rolled his eyes when Isaac entered now held the door open, not out of duty, but respect. Outside in the corridor, a janitor paused, mid-sweep, lowered his mop, and offered a thermos. "Still warm," he muttered. "Thought you might want some real coffee." Isaac took it without a word. Just nodded once. Reporters parted as he walked past, not pushing, not probing. One lowered her camera. Another removed her press badge. A young man in a suit stepped back, his mouth twitching like he wanted to speak, but couldn't. Instead, he simply opened his wallet and pressed a folded $5 bill into Isaac's hand. "For the bus, or whatever." Isaac said nothing. His gaze drifted upward toward the flag hanging over the exit, creased, slightly faded, but still there. Like him. Down the marble steps, a group of veterans stood waiting. No speeches. No salute. Just presence. One of them, a man in a brown jacket with silver hair and a limp, stepped forward. "You carried us all," he said softly. "Now, let us walk with you." Isaac nodded again. Not as thanks. Not as pride. Just acknowledgement. A small boy broke from his mother's grasp, ran up, and tugged at Isaac's sleeve. "Were you really a hero?" he asked. Isaac looked down at him, eyes clouded not with pride, but something deeper. He knelt, slowly, and placed a single medal into the boy's palm. "Heroes aren't loud," he said. "They just keep going." The boy looked up as if understanding something too big to name. His mother, watching from a distance, wiped a tear and mouthed, "Thank you." No one cheered. No one clapped. But when Isaac reached the street corner, a man who once refused to serve him at the diner stood outside with 2 coffee cups and a bag of bread. He didn't speak, just held them out. Isaac took them both. And when he sat down on the bench outside the courthouse, the same bench where weeks earlier he was ignored, a woman joined him. No words, no small talk, just sat beside him as if to say, "You're not invisible anymore." A breeze picked up. The sun stretched over the rooftops. And as Isaac stared down Main Street, past the flags, past the traffic lights, something inside him eased. "This place used to feel like nothing," he whispered to no one. "Maybe it can be home again." The diner on Main Street looked almost the same, but something in the air had shifted. The counter had been polished to a quiet shine. The same stools waited in perfect line. But above the register now hung a folded flag, aged, framed in dark walnut. Beneath it, a brass plaque, engraved with just 3 words. He sat here. No one explained it. No one needed to. Beneath that plaque was a photo. Isaac Trenner, younger, in uniform, the desert wind frozen in his collar. A second frame beside it held the medal that never made it home. Until now. Oh. It hadn't been a government order. No mayor's speech. No headlines. It was Henry, the busboy who once walked past Isaac without looking, who suggested they clean the spot. It was Clara from the VFW who found the photo. It was Ruth, the waitress who'd once winced at his coat, who placed the plaque without a sound and wiped her eyes as she did. None of them said, "Sorry." They just moved, slowly, together, like people, trying to fix something sacred. Students began showing up on weekends. Not for credit, but to listen. One teacher read Isaac's name during morning announcements. A week later, her class made a display board with copies of his service record and handwritten notes. One read, "I didn't know silence could hurt people. I do now." Isaac never spoke at these things. He never stood before a room, never told his version, but others did. Ethan Morgan, the deputy who'd handed Isaac his coat, made a short film, just 5 minutes long, all black and white, no music, just footage of Isaac walking through town, sitting quietly, folding a flag with trembling fingers. That video passed through veteran groups, high school assemblies, church gatherings. And every time someone watched it, a little bit of the silence cracked. One afternoon, a teenage boy in a varsity jacket stepped into the diner. He didn't order. He just walked to the plaque, stood there a long time, then turned to Ruth and asked, "Is he ever coming back?" She nodded, barely. "He still stops by sometimes. Always alone, always early." At the library, a small shelf had been added. Local heroes. His name was the first card. No fanfare. Just one photo, one pair of old boots, and a quote typed beneath. The quiet ones carry more than medals. And then one morning, as the sun filtered through old glass and the streets were still wet from a quiet rain, Isaac Trenner walked into the diner. He took his seat. Second from the end, looked up at his own photograph, then down at his hand. He didn't speak. But when Ruth placed the coffee before him, she smiled and whispered, "Good to have you home." Isaac didn't smile back. He just nodded, once, and looked out the window, toward a town that had once forgotten him, now learning how to remember. Under the soft glow of late afternoon, the diner felt almost like a chapel, quiet, warm, held together by memory and light. At the table by the window, Isaac Trenner sat across from Ethan. No uniforms now, no salutes, no judgment between them. Just a chipped white mug in each hand, and the hush of silverware clinking faintly in the distance. The world outside moved in slow silence, like it knew this conversation didn't need to be rushed. Ethan stirred his coffee once, then let the spoon rest. "Didn't think I'd need you again," he said, eyes fixed on the steam as it curled upward. Isaac didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window. Same street he'd walked 1,000 times. Same town that once passed him by. Then gently, he turned back and said, "You didn't. But I came anyway." No more words came after that. They didn't need them. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn baseball cap. It was sun-bleached and soft around the edges. He laid it on the table, brim toward Isaac. The same one Isaac had lost in the rain that day outside the courthouse. The day he had walked in invisible. Without ceremony, Isaac picked it up, turned it once in his hands, and nodded. The jukebox in the corner clicked to life, unprompted, playing something old and slow. Sinatra, maybe? Or a gospel tune with no lyrics. Just hums and a hush. Light from the window fell across the table in a stripe of gold, catching the faint dust in the air. For a moment, neither man moved. They just breathed in the silence, like men who had both earned the right to sit still. A waitress passed by, refilled the mugs without a word. She smiled faintly and left 2 sugar packets beside Isaac's cup, just like he used to take it. He didn't touch them. Then Ethan spoke again, voice lower this time. "You ever regret staying quiet all those years?" Isaac looked at him, steady, then shook his head. "Some things speak louder when you don't shout." There was no need for a speech, no need for long apologies. Only Ethan's hand, reaching across the table, resting on Isaac's forearm. Not a grip, not a shake, just enough to say, "I see you now." Outside, the wind moved gently through the town square, rustling the leaves around the monument. Inside, the 2 men sat quietly, as the shadows stretched long across the floor. Then, without speaking, they stood together. No clink of chairs, no fuss. Just 2 men, one old and one older, walking out the same door, side by side. Not as a hero and his witness, not as a father and a son, just as 2 souls finally meeting in the same light. The story didn't stay inside the courtroom. It drifted outward like mist, through open doors, carried by whispers more powerful than shouts. In a 5th-grade classroom, 2 blocks from the courthouse, a teacher paused her lesson and pointed to a grainy photo taped beside the chalkboard. Not of a president or general, but of a quiet man named Frank Trenner, sitting straight-backed in a courtroom chair, wearing a coat stitched with years and a gaze that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He didn't speak much, she told her students, but when he did, the room stopped. At the barbershop across town, a teenage boy named Jamal paused mid-joke as an old veteran hobbled in, his cane tapping softly on the tile. No one had to tell Jamal to stand. He just did, and held the door open a beat longer than needed. Down at the city library, a retired librarian had typed Frank's story onto a single sheet of yellow paper and pinned it to the community board between notices for lost dogs and free flu shots. People stopped to read it, then read it again. And still, Frank said nothing. He never talked about the trial, the humiliation, or the apology that shook a courtroom silent. But others did. Isaac did, his voice low, and even when a local reporter asked, "Why didn't your father say anything himself?" Isaac only shrugged. Because silence is how he fought, and forgiveness was his armor. In church pews, in union halls, in gymnasiums, after basketball games, people began saying his name differently, slower. "Damn him," with a nod. "Frank Trenner." Someone would murmur, and others would fall quiet, like it was a song they all knew but hadn't heard in years. And the young began to follow. One boy picked up a flag that had fallen outside the rec center. A girl handed her bus seat to a man wearing an old army jacket with frayed cuffs. No cameras, no hashtags, just change. In a middle school art class, a boy painted a mural on the wall. Not a hero with muscles and guns, but an old man, sitting alone with a duffel bag at his feet and medals tucked inside. The words above read, "He didn't want fame. He just wanted to be seen." And at the edge of town, where the wind moved slower and the street signs bore names older than most of the houses, a new sign had been quietly bolted in beside the old flagpole. Veterans Corner, dedicated to Frank Trenner. No ribbon cutting, no speech, just a wooden bench, and above it, the flag, raised each morning by students from the school nearby, their hands careful, their laughter quieter on those days. And somewhere across the city, a printer hummed to life, spitting out copies of a letter. One page. No signature, just a title. The day we remembered Frank. The paper passed from hand to hand, folded into back pockets, taped to fridge doors, left in church bulletins. And each time someone new read it, the silence afterward said more than applause ever could. Because now, when people say, Frank, they don't just mean a man. They mean a standard, a turning point, a reminder, and that reminder is still moving. Slowly, quietly, like wind over the hills, never rushing, but never stopping. Frank didn't speak. He didn't need to. As he stood beneath the polished bronze plaque, etched with his name, Sergeant Franklin D. Merritt, the afternoon sun caught the edge of the lettering and spilled soft gold across the wall. The Hall of Honor held its breath. Behind him, Isaac stood straight, hand over heart, and around them silence settled like snow. Not a silence of forgetting, but one of reverence, the kind that hums in your bones. A small girl placed her hand on her father's, whispering, "That's him, right?" Her father nodded, eyes wet, whispering, "That's the man who reminded us what it means to stand for something." Frank adjusted his collar, looked once at the flag swaying outside, steady as ever, then said quietly, "I wasn't looking for applause. I just didn't want to disappear. So, if this story moved you, stay, because the next name might be one you've walked past." Comment, dignity. If you believe silence should never erase sacrifice. And for those who still honor what it means to serve, this is your place. Stay with us.